As we speak, the president just went on a 4-tweet storm. So I want to bring in some experts. 3 people who know the inner workings of the Trump White House are insiders. Yamiche Alcindor, White House correspondent for PBS NewsHour. Ashley Parker, Pulitzer Prize-winning White House reporter for The Washington Post, both MSNBC political analysts. And Jeff Mason, White House correspondent for Reuters. Ashley, tell us what you can about what is going on inside the West Wing yesterday. I mean, this morning, I haven't even read through them yet, but the president is certainly letting it rip on Twitter. The question is he standing with the rest of the White House?
Well, there's competing tensions in the White House on this, as there are on a number of issues. And speaking broadly, you have John Bolton, who is always sort of more, or almost always more hawkish than the president, and a lot of people in the White House really pushing for a strong response on Iran and these recent attacks. There's some concern may sort of give him the leverage he needs internally to make his case. You have Secretary Pompeo on that side. Gina Haspel at the CIA was apparently also urging action. And the president, his impulses are really torn, and they always are when it comes to foreign policy. On the one hand, there is that urge against endless wars. He is sort of always, with a few notable exceptions, been very hesitant about getting involved in foreign conflicts in faraway lands, especially in the Middle East, stuff that he doesn't view as America first. But he also hates to be seen as someone who's weak, as someone who is pushed around on the world stage. And you can look back even to his presidency, where he did authorize Tomahawk missile strikes in Syria, for instance, in the early months. And when he felt Kim Jong-un of North Korea was disrespecting him, he promised a reign of fire and fury, although, of course, that has shifted. So he is also pulled between wanting to be a deal maker, not wanting to get drawn in, and wanting to seem tough. And I think if you look at his tweets, which I'm sure you will do, he sort of actually goes inside and explains exactly what he was thinking when the White House had authorized these strikes and then suddenly, at the very last minute, called them off.
And I want to go through that right now. Yamiche, Times reporting that Pompeo, John Bolton, Gina Haspel all favored a military response. Suddenly, the president said no way. Moments ago, he just tweeted exactly what happened inside the White House or why the change occurred. The president tweets this. President Obama made a desperate and terrible deal with Iran, gave them $150 billion plus $1.8 billion in cash. Iran was in big trouble, and he bailed them out, gave them a free path to nuclear weapons, and soon, instead of saying thank you, Iran yelled, "Death to America." I terminated the deal, which was not even ratified by Congress, and imposed strong sanctions. They are a much weakened nation today than at the beginning of my presidency, when they were causing major problems throughout the Middle East. Now they are bust. On Monday, they shot down an unmanned drone flying in international waters. We were cocked and loaded to retaliate last night on 3 different sites when I asked, how many will die? 150 people, sir, was the answer from a general. 10 minutes before the strike, I stopped it. Not proportionate to shooting down an unmanned drone. I'm in no hurry. Our military is rebuilt, new and ready to go. By far the best in the world. Sanctions are biting, and more added last night. Iran can never have nuclear weapons, not against the USA and not against the world. Yamiche, so the president laying it out there, you may have had Gina Haspel, John Bolton, and Mike Pompeo saying, let's move forward. And the president said, not so fast.
Well, all along, there wasn't a question. There was a big question of whether or not the president simply changed his mind or whether there was a strategic change in the mission. What we now know is that the president's laying out there that he did not want to kill 150 people in Iran. And as a result, he went with his gut and did this last minute change. I think what we see here is a president really is stuck between 2 places. He wants to look strong. He wants to make sure that Iran doesn't have a nuclear weapon and that they know not to shoot down U.S. drones. But he also knows that he made this very clear promise to his supporters not to get into another war. I talked to so many Trump supporters who backed him because they did not want working class men and women to be going off to war in a country that they didn't understand and really not getting into another war that looks like Afghanistan or Iraq. So what we have is the president essentially admitting, look, at the last minute, I decided, you know what, I don't want to go through with this. He is, of course, leaving it very open that this could happen again. He said, not right now. I'm not in a rush. He didn't say, I don't want to do this and I'm never going to do this again. So I think we're going to still be in a very tense situation, and Washington's still going to be very much watching closely what the president decides to do today.
Jeff, there's no current defense secretary. Patrick Shanahan leaving. The new acting secretary doesn't start until Monday. How much power does this put in the president's hands?
Well, the president always has a lot of power over military affairs. It's his decision in the end. And as he just illuminated in that tweet, he decided, as Yamiche just said, at the last minute not to go forward. I thought it was interesting that he indicated that it was when a general told him that 150 people would die that he decided that wasn't a good decision. And one wonders when that general told him that. If it was just 10 minutes beforehand, that seems a little hard to believe that they wouldn't have discussed that during the hours of deliberations they had before setting those three strikes up in the first place. But clearly he is, he does have some competing advice. The other reporters have gone over the people at the White House who are advocating for. I think there are some people at the Pentagon who are advocating against. And the president has to weigh the possibility of escalation, how that might affect not only people's lives, but also the economy, the world economy, and the U.S. economy as he goes into a political campaign where he's very proud of the fact that the economy and the stock market have done so well.
Let's put this in perspective, even what the president has said this week. On Monday, he had a very different tone at his campaign kickoff event. I want to listen to that.
We're charting a path to stability and peace in the Middle East because great nations do not want to fight endless wars. They've been going on forever. Starting to remove a lot of troops. We're finally putting America first.
Ashley, that was Monday, the president talking about removing troops. Now here we are. Is there a clear path?
I mean, I think that's what they were. First of all, this president and other presidents, there are no easy answers when it comes to questions of war, when it comes to questions of the Middle East. And that is what the president is now grappling with. He does it. He's made very clear in that clip you played and frankly his entire candidacy. He does not want endless wars. He is very skeptical of conflagrations in the Middle East and what the U.S.'s involvement of young men and women should be. At the same time, there's moments when he wants to sound really tough, when he doesn't want to be pushed around. And this is also a president, it's worth keeping in mind, who very much in some ways his foreign policy could be defined as anti-Obama, and especially early on, he wanted to do whatever the opposite of what his predecessor had done. And he sort of thought President Obama was weak on Iran. So you can see him kind of trying to set himself apart in contrast from President Obama, also kind of staying true to his own principles of generally being anti-intervention, but with some, again, very notable exceptions. So it is a real debate. It is a real deliberation, not just in the advisors around the president, but even sort of within the president's own gut and impulses.
Hey there, I'm Chris Hayes from MSNBC. Thanks for watching MSNBC on YouTube. If you want to keep up to date with the videos we're putting out, you can click subscribe just below me or click over on this list to see lots of other great videos.